how does this actually work? So I'll read you 3 sentences from a scholarly paper on the mechanism of action of Iboga. Initially, Iboga's mechanism of action was hypothesized to involve antagonism of the N-methyl D-aspartate type glutamate MDMA receptor. However, 18-MC, which is negligible MD, etc., etc., nobody knows how this stuff works. All this gobbledygook about the potential brain stuff and which chemicals are involved, which brain circuits. What I can tell you is that it does seem to rewire your endorphin receptors. So I did Ibogaine a number of years. It's okay. It's good. Thank you. I did Ibogaine a number of years ago. I was not for any addiction or anything. Just because why not? You know. And as Trevor said, I was functionally Parkinsonian for about 8 hours. I mean, and I didn't have a deep spiritual experience either, but then I never do. But for 3 months afterwards, there was a kind of negativity that was lacking in my life. The kind of an automatic default dark view of the world, and they said the effects last 3 months, almost to the clock. 3 months later, all of a sudden, overnight, that positive shield that I had disappeared. So it clearly did something to my brain receptors. It did rewire something, not permanently, but it did. And I really enjoyed those 3 months. And now, of course, the thing is, you know, how do you get there without relying on substances? But the point is, it does do something in the brain that probably has to do with the endorphin receptors, which is why it is so powerful in preventing withdrawal. And it's quite amazing that you have a client who's been on heroin. Well, I can tell you one case. I had an email some years ago from a husband of a woman who'd been a heroin addict for something like 15 years and then was put on methadone, and she's been on methadone on 10 years. Now, methadone is an opiate that is a legal opiate when it's prescribed. It's a long-acting one, and it simply is the replacement of one opiate addiction with another. So it's not that when you're on methadone, it's not that you're addicted, it's just that you're addicted to something legal that you don't have to inject, you can just take it by mouth. So that provides some benefit for some people, but people hate it, and they're on it because if they got off it, the withdrawal is horrible. So they are on it for decades sometimes. It might help them function better, but this woman called it liquid handcuffs, you know. So they live in Toronto, and I said, okay, I just happen to come to Toronto for next week for a speaking engagement. Why don't you meet me at my hotel? We'll talk about it. In todders this, her name is Lisa, in todders this wildly made up, lipstick smudged, stiletto heeled, dressed up like a tart, woman in her late 30s, squeaking like a little girl. And so I talked to him about half an hour, and I said, look, if you want to get off the methadone, do the Ibogaine. And then come and do ayahuasca with us. So that's what she did. So she went to Mexico to a clinic. This is before Trevor's operation was going. And she got off, literally within 2 weeks she was off her opiates. So this is after 25 years of opiate use. She was no longer craving and not suffering any withdrawal, which is absolutely mind-blowing. And again, it's one more thing that as a physician I hadn't heard about until about 5 years ago, maybe even less. And it's astonishing that here's this modality that even if we take your statistics of 65%, Trevor, and even if we reduce them to half, it's still amazing. It's still amazing. So, now my point about Ibogaine though is that there's a reason why people get addicted. So we see the addiction as the primary problem, but it isn't. Let me just ask you, addiction is any behavior that people pursue, they crave, they find some temporary pleasure or relief in, but continue with it despite negative consequences. So that's any behavior. It's not to do with substances. Anything that you crave, find pleasure in, and you pursue despite negative consequences, by which definition How many of us here have addictive behaviors in our lives? Just put your hand up if you have. Okay, that's most of us. So if I asked you not what was wrong with it, but what was right about it, I'm not asking you what you were addicted to, when or for how long, but simply what did you get from it in the short term? What would somebody say? Just put your hand up and tell me what you got. Yeah?
Escape.
From
Just the unpleasantness of...
So some pain.
Yeah.
Okay, escape. So pain relief, yeah? Okay, what else? Anybody else? Yeah?
Discovering I existed.
Okay, some sense of yourself, is that right? Okay, great, thank you. Yes?
I would say comfort in sort of the predictability of the routine.
Comfort in a predictable...
Of the routine that goes with consuming that particular thing.
Okay. Yeah?
Reduction of stress.
Reduction of stress. Now take all that stuff. Yeah, one more.
Like connection and ritual.
Connect them with what?
Like connection to
There's something greater than you.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So look, if you look at all that you said, reduction of stress, pain relief, connection to something greater, whatever else you said, anything wrong with any of that? Isn't that what we all want? In other words, the addiction is not the problem. The addiction was your attempt to solve the problem. And the real issue is, why did you lack connection? Why did you have so much pain? How come you had that much stress? And how come you had no internal capacity to handle the stress? So that you had to soothe it. So this idea that addiction being a primary brain disease, which is the official medical view, is utter nonsense. The addiction is the attempt to solve a problem, which also means that just because you've solved the addiction problem, you still haven't solved the problem. So therefore, Ibogaine can't be the, and Trevor talked about this door. The Ibogaine can't be the, it's not the end of the road, it's the beginning of it. And so, that's why I suggested to Lisa, well, come and do the ayahuasca afterwards. Really get to know yourself, go deeply with your issues, and particularly the traumas, and the way you've compensated for your traumas, which is really what's kept you addicted. So that's really important. Now, Lisa, you should see her now. No longer wearing stiletto heels, no longer stupidly made up, speaks with the really resonant voice of an adult woman. You should just see her. She just embodies presence. And on the other hand, there's Cynthia, who's a woman from the downtown east side, who Trevor knows. Cynthia began her journey with us with ayahuasca. She had a lot of insight, a lot of learning. We raised funds to send her to Mexico, did the Ibogaine there, got her for opiate, didn't stay long enough in Mexico to integrate anything. She was eager to get back to her boyfriend, I think, in Vancouver. The first 3 months, it didn't last 2 weeks, it lasted 3 months for her. She would walk down the street, people that knew her in the downtown inside would rush up to her from across the street to ask her, what happened to you? Because she was just radiating presence, radiating light. She's such a wonderful light in her that's completely obscured when she's using. And there she was clear of it. And it was magnificent to see. And then, because she stayed in this relationship with somebody who was using and dysfunctional, because her attachment needs were still dominating her life, she ended up using again and has suffered terrific consequences. So it's not to say that are there any panaceas out there, but it is the case that Ibogaine does open a door. It creates a possibility, it's a possibility that simply there's nothing anywhere remotely like it in the standard medical repertoire. We're terrible dealing with addictions. We're terrible at dealing with opiate addictions. The best we can do for severe users is to put them on an equally addictive opiate and maintain them on it. And here's an opportunity for people to actually let go of the physical dependence and then to begin a growth process. And so, for all the psychedelic work, in terms of the specific addiction work, and most specifically for opiate addiction work, there's just nothing more exciting than the Ibogaine possibility. I'm just hoping that the kind of rigid and utterly irrational hostility that dominates drug policy, and particularly in the US, but very much in Canada as well, will not somehow inhibit the work with Ibogaine. And I wonder, really, is it that they get it, or is it that they don't? It's not enough on their radar yet to have clamped down on it yet. Maybe you have more of a sense than that. But in any case, so long as it's possible to do this work, it really is an exciting area of addiction treatment. I think we'll take questions, is that right?
Okay, since we're recording this, I'm going to pass the mic to people and then I'm going to run it back to the presenters so that they could answer. So.
So as I mentioned, the cool thing about opiate addiction and Ibogaine is we just wait till somebody's in a slight bit of withdrawal and then we can administer the medicine. It is effective. I always tell people it's kind of effective at interrupting any negative pattern that you've got going on that you would like to step away from. The thing with alcoholism is we can't treat somebody who's in a detox mode. So with alcoholism and stimulant use as well, we need people to be off for at least a couple of weeks. And it's a slightly different treatment protocol, but we've seen good success as well with some alcoholic and ketamine even addiction. So adverse events, I think the biggest thing with that is preparation to avoid them from happening. With the low dosing, we do that, the 3 days of low dosing. When my business partner and I made the decision to do that, that's not a very common thing within the Ibogaine world. Normally it's you come in, you have a small test dose just to basically make sure you're not allergic to it, and then they hit you hard with that flood dose the next day. We find with the low dosing over the course of 3 days, it really works like a truth serum. You get to see where people are at. You get to find out if people actually are ready to stop taking opiates. We tried to treat somebody else for free from the downtown east side as well. But after day 3 of low dosing, she said, I'm not ready to let go of this. And then we have the same thing with kind of health things. If we see over the course of those few days that things aren't going well, maybe they're not consuming enough liquid, they're not eating enough meals, we'll send somebody home, we'll refund their money. It's $6,500 plus GST to come stay with us. And that's 10 days at, that's a 6,500 square foot house on a couple of acres. So there is a lot of expense. We're definitely not getting rich doing it.
Thank you very much.
I think Trevor will want to certainly answer this one as well. And this is a conversation I've had with Ibogaine providers in Mexico, for example. I'm not, I mean, you can't generalize, but my experience of the Ibogaine it was an intense physical experience. For me, it didn't come anywhere close to the insight and depth that I get with the ayahuasca. And I just find that, first of all, Ibogaine is intensely physically uncomfortable. I mean, you can get uncomfortable with the ayahuasca, but it's nothing like the Ibogaine. You know, you get really ataxic. You just can't even move without assistance. Secondly, Ibogaine, not Iboga, which is the root plant, but Ibogaine does not lend itself to ceremonial use, in the sense that you're really on your own and you're with a couple of handlers who have to look after you. With ayahuasca, we get to be with 25 people in ceremony together. And it's a very, you know, just a different experience. People are chanting to you or chanting to the group very specifically in response to the energy that's being evoked at that particular moment. So it's more interactive that way. Rightly or wrongly, but my sense is that the Ibogaine can do what ayahuasca can't do, which is to interrupt the addiction and to prevent withdrawal. But in terms of which plant then can take you deeper into yourself and in a way that you can integrate it to your life afterwards, for me that's the ayahuasca. So I don't know what Trevor might say about that.
Yeah, I would agree. We're big proponents of people staying on a plant medicine journey after Iboga. It's often said that you visit Mr. Iboga once, the stern father, and then you can go to the loving mother of ayahuasca multiple times after that. I heard, it's all with all these medicines, it's so hard to describe what happens to a person, but I heard Dimitri, who's kind of the rock star in the Iboga world, once say, somebody asked him what's the difference between Ibogaine and ayahuasca, and he said he'd done multiple Iboga journeys, and I think he said 16 ayahuascas at the time. And he said, from what I can see, Iboga comes from the earth. It is a root. It takes you deep into the ancestry. It's very earthy, very rooty, whereas ayahuasca's from space.
Well, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, if you can put somebody through a rapid detox successfully, that's great, there's no argument. But the reality is, that's very few people. And especially people who've been on methadone, there's no way to do a rapid detox with methadone. Methadone actually persists in your tissues for weeks, and it's much more difficult to withdraw from methadone than it is from morphine, for example, or from heroin. That's why Trevor was people on the short-acting opiate first. You can't take somebody and work them, So there are some people you can put through a rapid detox, and they do okay with it, but that's not usually the chronic opiate addicts. And most of them will not do well in a rapid detox, and we see that over and over again because they cycle through the detox in the downtown east side. People coming back to detox and coming back to detox. It gives them a bit of a cleanup for a while, but inevitably it doesn't work for them. So again, it's just not broadly applicable what you're saying. Other than that, I think no matter how you detox, whether through Ibogaine or rapid detox, whatever. Again, like I said before, that's where it begins. That's where it begins, because all the stuff that made you addicted in the first place, all the shame, all the pain, all the guilt, all the spiritual disconnection, the huge vacuum that you're carrying inside yourself, all that doesn't go away just because you've got off the drug. That's when you have to begin to deal with all that stuff.
Yeah, there's not enough research on the hard science regarding this, for sure, but we're dealing with a visionary plant medicine. So people often come back with descriptions of what they saw happening on a cellular level. And with a rapid detox, my understanding is it's almost like taking that opiate, ripping it out of the system, and the opiate receptor is still going to be sitting there going, where's my opiate? Whereas with Ibogaine, we've heard through the description of people's visions, is they can see what's happening on a cellular level. The reason we wait for them to go into a bit of withdrawal is that means the opiate receptor is open and free, willing to take something. The Ibogaine seems to go in and scrub it and bring it to an opiate naive state as if it had never had an opiate before. Whereas the rapid detox, it sure remembers that it's had an opiate before. Perhaps. We need more research. I guess there's just a long way to go with kind of legitimizing these medicines and bringing them more to the forefront so that they could be used potentially in a more clinical hospital setting, maybe part of a public healthcare system. But even when we were working out of the townhouse, we still charged $6,500 a person. We only took one person at a time, but in order to pay a nurse $1,000 to come, in order to work with our doctor, in order to feed a person, in order to, we have at least 2 people on staff for the 10 days straight, at only $15 an hour. Very quickly that adds up. So I think as this comes more into the light and where it's more easily accessible, then that's where it's going to happen. But trying not to raise our costs beyond what they're at right now. So I hope there's a way in the future that this is going to be made more widely available. Another thing that's happening is there are people working in Squamish, for example, that do more of the psychospiritual route, and they have been trained a bit more in the Bwiti way. You can bring in a group of people. There's a ceremony that happened a week ago or so ago with people from England that come.
No, with Ibogaine.
No, with Iboga, the root bark itself. Yeah, so by working with Iboga, the root bark itself, doing it in a group setting with people who are not quite as vulnerable as drug addicts, that's another answer.
The reality is, under the present social dispensation and medical ideology and limitations of awareness, it's impossible to bring this work in any kind of large way to the people that most need it. If, on the other hand, there was some, in other words, if the social understanding caught up with the reality, then we'd find that this is actually cost effective. Because if you looked at what it costs in terms of healthcare costs to look after people deeply addicted to HIV and everything else, if you looked at the legal costs, if you looked at the cost of the medications that they need, the methadone and everything else that they're taking and all that, we would actually be saving a lot of money. But as in so many ways, that would take some long-term vision and some openness that we're nowhere near having. And in that context, it's going to be what I said last night. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. The ones that most need it will not have access to it, except maybe through acts of charity. For example, so if Trevor's Downtown Eastside Initiative attracts funders and donors, but even that's going to affect a small number of people. I mean, at the very best. So really, the best outlook is if conferences like this and others, and an increasing consciousness of these possibilities and potentials is broadcast into the world and is taken to people in your lives, then perhaps eventually be able to make it happen on a social level. But short of that, it's going to be what it is, which is that the people with the bucks will get the treatment.
And that's another thing is, an opiate addiction, a heroin addiction is very expensive.
Yeah.
So it's cost effective to spend $6,500 once and get that over with. Whereas Ibogaine's been touted as something that's really good to help depression. I've experienced that as well. But depression's free. It doesn't, in order to approach, so it's cost effective for an opiate addict to come, or perhaps a different type of addict, but unfortunately it's not that cost effective for other ailments as of yet. People ask me, they'll phone and say, well, will this work for me? And I tell a story. We've had a 21-year-old man come in, still lived with his parents, hadn't been kicked out of the house yet, fairly new to using. It was still working for him. We treated him, and he did eventually go back to using. Again, his life is much better now. And then we had a 39-year-old woman, been using for 20 years. By the time she came in to see us, she was injecting into her forehead, and that was the last spot. And she had fought for those 20 years to try and get off dope. She had tried everything to try and do that. And now she's here, star, and she's one of our employees. More than a year and a half clean, and she took what we gave her and almost 2 years, yeah. She took what we gave her and ran with it. She listened to our advice on, well, what are your empowering habits going to be? She put together a rule of 5 things she was going to do every day. So she just hit that point where she was ready to change. You're sick and tired of being sick and tired. That's, I think, where you need to be. And we've seen, I mentioned emotional immaturity in that slide. The emotional immaturity is seen in acts like we treated a gentleman who came in. He had ordered LSD. He wasn't sure, off of the internet. had a horrible experience, 28 years old, had this horrible experience that stuck with him for days. So I don't know if it was LSD, but then he thought it would be a good deal to order some heroin off the internet in order to kill that pain. So he was here to us after about that, 8 months down that road, and he just it wasn't quite there yet. But again, I think he's doing much better.
You know, I understand your response. When Trevor said immature, I shook my head. Because what addict do I know that isn't immature by definition, you know? And immature not as a pejorative, but as somebody who didn't have the conditions where they could mature. You know, but then I thought about it as he was speaking, and it's my experience too. When you get very young people, they haven't suffered enough yet. Their suffering hasn't matured yet. They, like a young woman I can think about, it did the Ibogaine. But you know, this is another one other than Cynthia, who I mentioned, but somebody who was still wanted to get validation through being sexually attractive to men. And that didn't change because she did the Ibogaine. So she got off her opiates, but she still kept creating a lifestyle for herself that incurred more and more suffering, and hence she goes back to her drug use. So maturation is kind of arbitrary. When does somebody mature? It's not a question of maturity so much, in my case, in my view, so much as have I suffered enough yet that I get that this isn't working for me anymore. And some people are there, some people are not there.
So for one, Valium is not to be used in conjunction with opiates. So by the time we administer Valium, opiates are well out of their system. But we have tried everything. We've tried so many other things. Valium seems to be the most benign of what's available. I think you could go into more hardcore sleep things. Some people don't need it though, and some people have had issues with benzo addiction, and we don't administer it. So at around that 36-hour point, they're pretty close to falling asleep on their own. Well, I'll often say, don't take that Valium until you're almost there on your own. And that's just gonna push you over the edge. But we use valerian root, we use melatonin, we use kind of copious amounts of valerian root even in the days leading up to the big dose. So we're totally open to other options. That's an incredible frustration for us. That's one of the worst aspects of this gig, is if somebody just cannot fall asleep after. And we've seen that. We went through an experience recently with a gentleman where he was supposed to leave on Wednesday. We kept him till Saturday. That's the other thing, is it's not cookie cutter. You're done at 10 days, we'll push you out of here. If we see that somebody's not done, we'll keep them for additional length of time. But this guy did not sleep, until that very last day. And then he's, again, doing awesome. So we try and keep Liberty Root overall kind of as secular as possible. We want atheists to be able to come and do Iboga as well, although we had a lifelong atheist leave last week saying, I know there's a God now. So we try and, I'm a very spiritual guy, my business partner is spiritual, but we really try and keep it open to everybody. We do smudge, we do Native American smudging prior to any time administering the medicine. We often say that that's about as hippie as we get. But we play traditional Bwiti music as well, music that has grown out of Iboga. And but overall, the thing with Iboga is you mentioned the kind of those resorts in Mexico. I say to people often, you're not coming here for a vacation. They'll say, well, what will I do when I'm there? You'll be taking medicine every day when you're here, and it'll be between you and that route. So it's something there. We provide an incredibly safe setting. We check the set and prepare the set as much as possible in the client's psychology before we administer medicine. But then it's really between the medicine and that person. For us, of course, you saw the Bwiti. The Bwiti do a much different thing, and that's something I'm no expert on, but something I'd like to learn a lot more about eventually.